Nicola Sturgeon, Deputy First Minister and member of the Advisory Board for the Yes Scotland campaign. We have a series of questions posed by readers on the independence referendum campaign. We had some questions based on the pre-referendum stage. Firstly, why should the SNP, with its majority in the Scottish Parliament, get to set the rules of the referendum when it wants a particular outcome? And will you accept and implement the Electoral Commission's guidance on the question?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the referendum will be conducted to the very highest standards of integrity and propriety. That's in the interest of both sides in the campaign, because we all want people to have a good debate, make their decision, and then all of us be in a position to respect the outcome. The second point I would make is that the rules around the referendum will be set in exactly the same way by the Scottish Parliament as would be the case by the UK Parliament if this was a UK-run referendum. The proposals are that the Scottish Government makes proposals, the Electoral Commission gives us advice, and then ultimately the Scottish Parliament decides. And you know, the views of the Electoral Commission carry enormous weight, and ultimately the Scottish Parliament will consider that and come to its decision. That's exactly what would happen if this was a UK-run referendum.
Why don't we have a provisional negotiated settlement with the UK Government first, and then people can vote on that so that people know exactly what they're going to be deciding on in 2014?
Well, I made clear recently that I do think there is scope for much more discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. You know, we take different views on the referendum. We want different outcomes to the referendum. I'll be campaigning for a yes vote. The UK Government will be trying to persuade people to vote no. But that doesn't mean that we can't come together in the best interests of the Scottish people. That's what we did in negotiating the Edinburgh Agreement. So I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that the independence settlement should be negotiated before people have had the chance to vote in a referendum and see whether or not they want Scotland to be independent. But what I do think is reasonable before the referendum happens is for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to come together and to reach a shared understanding of the kind of issues that will need to be negotiated if people vote yes, what approach we'll take to these negotiations, what the factual underpinning for the discussions will be. I also think it's reasonable to expect the UK Government in reserved areas to share information with the Scottish Government. And why is all that reasonable? Because it all contributes to making sure that people have an informed debate and can result in an informed decision. So the Scottish Government is very up for these discussions, and I hope the UK Government will join us.
We also, as you'd imagine, had questions on the post-referendum stage. How will an independent Scotland tackle an issue like intergenerational poverty in a city like Glasgow when governments at Westminster and Holyrood have tried and failed so far?
Well, for me, the ability to tackle poverty is one of the strongest arguments for independence. Now, that's not to say that the Scottish Government shouldn't do absolutely everything it can now. We've got powers in health and education, employability, and we need to use these powers as effectively as we possibly can to lift people out of poverty. But what we have just now is a situation where, as the Scottish Government does that, decisions from the UK Government, particularly just now around welfare reforms, are undermining the efforts that we're making. So the welfare reforms coming from Westminster, which we have no say in, we don't agree with, but we can't stop happening, are actually putting more people into poverty, and they're leading to a situation where the gap between rich and poor is getting bigger, not smaller. So my argument is that if we have a Scottish Parliament with the powers we have just now, health, education, employability, coupled with the powers over tax and benefits, then we'll be much better able to tackle poverty effectively and do it for the long term. We'll also, of course, have the ability to decide how our resources are invested. For example, we'll be able to say no to the investment of billions of pounds in weapons of mass destruction on the River Clyde and instead prioritise investment in our young people and tackling poverty. So that's the benefit that being independent brings you.
Will Scotland have enough money required to fund all of these policies after independence and some new desires, for example, an increase in foreign aid, which was mentioned just last week? And can the Scottish Government guarantee just now that policies like free tuition fees, nursery education, prescriptions would all continue as they are in an independent Scotland?
Well, let me answer that question in two parts. Firstly, the things that we do in Scotland just now, whether things that the Scottish Government does, like free prescriptions, free education, or the spend by the UK Government on the welfare system, for example, Scottish taxpayers already fund all of that spending and a little bit more. I mean, if you look at the most recent figures, you know, Scotland contributes more to the UK Treasury than we get back in spending, so we are more than able to pay our own way. And that would be the starting point of an independent Scotland, a country more than capable of standing in its own 2 feet. And actually, the UK Government admitted that just a couple of weeks ago. I don't think they meant to admit it, but they were desperately trying to show that the Scottish Government figures were wrong, which they're not, incidentally. But in the process of doing that, they actually admitted that the very worst case scenario at the starting point of independence is that we'd be no worse off than we are just now. I think actually we'd be a bit better off. But the second part of my answer is about the ability that being independent gives you to grow the wealth of the country and to make different choices about how we spend that wealth. So having economic powers over direct and indirect taxation, allows us to take decisions that get our economy growing faster, that encourage companies to invest more, to employ more people, to raise the tax revenues, and also it allows us to make different decisions. So if we want to, using the example you cite, spend more on international aid or spend more trying to lift people in Scotland out of poverty, then we could do that by not spending money on nuclear weapons, for example. So independence at the starting point would see us no worse off and, in my view, better off than we are just now. But the ability that the powers of independence gives us to do things differently is the real prize of being independent.
Have you considered the future of the SNP after 2014? Either way, but particularly if it's a yes vote, what would be the point if it's mission accomplished? Would the party split along traditional political lines of left and right, and where would you be in that?
I'll be in the SNP for as long as I'm in politics, and the SNP will continue to exist as a political party. What's the point of that is that we have a very distinctive view of how Scotland should be governed. Right now we're the only mainstream party that's arguing the case for universal benefits, for example. We see the Tories, the Liberals and Labour now arguing against things like free education. So I would argue that we need a strong SNP in an independent Scotland to argue that case for social democracy. The one point I would make over and above that, though, of course, is that it would be up to the people of Scotland in an independent country to decide who was in government. You know, we vote on the principle of independence in the autumn of next year. There'll then be a process of negotiation, and we will be independent in time for the 2016 Scottish election, which is already scheduled. In that election, if that is the first election to an independent parliament, then people can decide, do they want the SNP, Labour or any other party? And that's the power of democracy. You know, right now in UK general elections, we often end up with governments that we don't vote for. You know, never once in my entire life has Scotland, a majority of people in Scotland voted Tory, and yet for more than half of my entire life, the Tories have been in government. Independence means we always get the governments we vote for. I hope that will be SNP governments more often than not, but that is up to the people of Scotland.
We also had several questions on the European Union and currency question. What are the benefits of Scotland staying in the European Union, and can you guarantee that we will use the pound without prior negotiations with the UK and the European Union on a currency, or is that just a SNP preference just now?
Well, firstly, the benefits of being in the European Union, I think, are obvious. Being in the European Union and crucially part of the internal market brings massive economic benefits to Scotland. We do very well in Scotland as a location for inward investment, and one of the reasons we do so well is because companies investing in Scotland have access to the internal market. It would be devastating for jobs if Scotland, because we were part of a UK wanting to come out of the European Union, found itself either marginalised in the European Union or outside of it. So I think the benefits of European Union membership are clear. I also believe, though, that we need a stronger voice in Europe. We need to be able to much more vigorously defend and assert our national interests. People want to see Scotland's national interests being protected and being asserted strongly, and I think we're far more able to do that if we have an independent seat at the top tables, instead of relying on a Westminster government that sometimes will have interests different to Scotland's to do that job for us. On currency, I think it's in the interest of Scotland to remain within sterling for the stability for our trade, for example, that delivers. But it's also overwhelmingly in the interest of the rest of the UK. If you look at the value of our oil and gas exports, our whisky exports, they contribute massively to the UK balance of payments, and it would be in the interest of the UK to keep Scotland in sterling. So that's a choice that I think would be right for Scotland, and I think most people in Scotland would agree with.
Okay. Could Scots still have a British passport after independence?
Yeah, they could. I think most Scots would opt to have a Scottish passport, but we're not being exclusive in that sense. You know, Scotland is a country that has for generations sent lots of people overseas, or people have chosen to go overseas. There are Scots diaspora in every corner of the globe. Likewise, people have chosen to come to live in Scotland. I represent a constituency where in one primary school alone you'll have more than 20 languages spoken. You know, this is not a debate about national identity. You know, I'm a very proud Scot, but people who feel British or Pakistani or Irish, they can still see the benefits of political and economic independence. So this is a debate about what kind of country do we want to be in Scotland, and what constitutional arrangement best equips us to deliver that kind of country. Is it Westminster government where the Tories can introduce things like welfare reform, or is it powers in our own parliament to make the decisions that are best for us?
Support for independence, according to most recent polls, seems to be lower now than any time since May 2011. Why do you think that is?
Well, different polls will show different things, and you know, it's a bit of a trite thing for a politician to say, but the poll that matters is the one on polling day. You know, I accept that we're behind in the opinion polls and we've got a job of work to do. I'm relishing the prospect of persuading people that independence is the best future for Scotland. Do I believe that polls can be overcome? Yes, I believe that. Why do I believe it? Because the SNP has done it not too long ago. You know, if you go back to I think January in 2011, the SNP was about 10-15 points behind in some opinion polls. We went on to win that election with an overall majority, and we did that because our arguments were the best arguments. We put forward the best case. We'll do that in the referendum campaign as well, and I think we'll convince people that independence is the best way to create the kind of country we want to be, while still having a friendly, constructive, close relationship with our partners across these islands.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much.